Good evening and welcome to tonight's live bibliotherapy session, which is going to be all about LGBTQI plus themes in modern and ancient literature. We're going to be romping through medieval literature of various sorts. We're going from Sappho to Sackville West, looking at some Roman literature. That is the Satyricon of Petronius, and moving on to some more brilliant modern books, which I'm very excited to share with you if you don't know them, just dropping things already. And I'm channeling this evening George Sands, who is one of the authors that we're going to be looking at, although we're not so much looking at her as looking at a book about her, which is a rather fabulous book called Briefly a Delicious Life by Nell Stevens. And reading that recently got me loving George Sands all over again. And she was very much someone who used to dress up as a man in order to get around more freely. She used to wear men's clothes and smoke cigarettes, use cigarette holders and even pipes. So we'll be coming on to her in a bit, but I'm going to start off talking about Petronius's Satyricon, which is considered one of the gems of Western literature, and it's the earliest of its kind in Latin. It puts together two contrasting genres of writing: the cynic, so the cynical kind of writing, and the parodic. And it also idealizes and uses sentimental Greek romance. So it's both cynical and sentimental, which is very unusual for that time. And the mixing of these two radically contrasting genres generates the sophisticated humour and the style of the whole book, which is a kind of collection of snippets in a way, the Satyricon. Let's face it, it's probably not something that people are going to read that much now, unless you are a Latin scholar. But it does have a gay theme. It has a kind of love triangle in which two men are both in love with a kind of slave boy. And it's interesting that in those days, homosexual activities had a tacit acceptance in elite Roman circles, as long as they were not attached to particularly effeminate behaviours. So it was okay to be gay as long as you were not too effeminate. And don't forget that in 130 AD, the Emperor Hadrian was so upset at the accidental death of his lover Antonius that he ordered him deified, which is pretty extreme and rather marvellous, I would say. So homosexual activities and homosexuality was accepted in Roman times, perhaps in ways much more than it has been until recently in modern times. Julius Caesar was also meant to have taken the passive role in an affair with King Nicomedes of Bithynia, and the rumours around this didn't do him any harm in the long term. So nobody was scathing of homosexuality in those days, unlike in the time of Chaucer. So Geoffrey Chaucer, with his fantastic book, The Canterbury Tales, he was actually quite censorious of homosexuality, which means that we're not going to be talking about him tonight. There he goes onto the floor. So Petronius's Latin novel, as it's called, a novel, which I love the fact that there was a novel back in the day in Roman times, the Satyricon features a homosexual love triangle as its protagonists. The romantic entanglements complicate their affairs, but it's not their sexual preferences that are the issue. It's more the fact of the entanglements themselves that give the story. So that in itself is a great thing in terms of the way that it's written. It's in no way being negative about homosexuality. It's actually just being negative about what happens to the men because of their love and the way it possibly makes them effeminate at times. So only fragments of the Satyricon unfortunately survive. It's not something that we have in its entirety, and it relates the adventures of En sorry, I'm going to get this wrong, Encolpius and his shifty friend Ascyltos as they vie for the love of Giton, Encolpius's lusty adolescent slave, who's constantly prey to more or less welcome sexual advances. So the slave, in this case, Ascyltos, is not in any way fending off these men. He's quite happy to go with the flow, so to speak. So, in a world where nothing appears to be held sacred, everyone eagerly sacrifices to the cult of Priapus, a deity you offend at your peril, as the narrator soon discovers. So, that is the Satyricon by Petronius, which is one of the earliest texts which describes homosexual love. And it's blasphemous, rude, and obscene, which are traits that are brought home by the new translation, newish translation by Andrew Brown. It's certainly among the more entertaining reads bequeathed to us by antiquity, and it's also all the more fun because it has this great gay love triangle at its heart. Also, something that I wasn't aware of is that Petronius's portrayal of the nouveau riche vulgarity, which is embodied by one of the characters in the book, Trimalchio, actually inspired F. Scott Fitzgerald in his book, The Great Gatsby. And apparently, the original title for The Great Gatsby was Trimalchio in West Egg. So, who knew that? It was actually Petronius that inspired the wonderful Fitzgerald to write The Great Gatsby. But that's more about the excesses of wealth rather than the gay theme in there. By the way, I'd love to know this evening if you have any particular favourite books which cover gay themes in antiquity or in the 18th century or in modern times. Do let me know. Send me messages. And also, if you do have any bibliotherapy related questions, send them in too, because I'm always here to answer your questions and they don't have to relate in depth to tonight's theme. So I'm going to be slightly jumping around this evening from different historical contexts, and I'm now moving on to a book called Passing by Nella Larsen. So I'm suddenly going from antiquity to the 1920s. So I hope you don't mind me racing around this evening, but it was a book that I was particularly drawn to and wanted to talk about. So this is Passing by Nella Larsen, which was written in 1925, and it's actually recently been made into a film, which some of you might have seen. It follows Irene Renfield, which in the film is played by Tessa Thompson, and Claire Kendry, who in the film is played by Ruth Negga. Set in 1920s New York, it's about two women who were childhood friends who bump into each other as adults and learn that they still have much in common. They're both married, mothers, and they're both mixed race. But this is where the contrast begins because one of the women passes as a white woman and lives with her husband, who is extremely racist and openly hates black people. And so that's what the passing is about to some degree, but it's also about passing, perhaps, in terms of sexuality, because the two women have a very strong sexual attraction to each other. And this goes on underneath the surface of the book. It's not actually obvious, and it's the same in the film, but it's very much there as a crackling sexuality lying beneath the surface, and it makes it all the more powerful as both a read and as a film. So I'd really recommend Passing by Nella Larsen as a great read, and it's also a really good film. And it also is quite interestingly relevant to the book The Vanishing Half, which many of you might have read, by Britt Bennett, which is another book about passing. That book also has a really excellent aspect of somebody who is changing from a man to a woman during the book, and that's very delicately handled and very beautifully done, and that's a great book. So The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett is also one to definitely read, but Passing by Nella Larsen is a really excellent and interesting read, with crackling sexuality between two women going on underneath the story, which is all about racism and passing as white. And I'll just give you a little bit of historical context before we move on to other books. So in the 1920s, the United States, it was a period marked by considerable anxiety and discussion over the crossing of racial boundaries. So this is more about racism than it is about sexuality, I must admit. The so-called colour line between blacks and whites. This anxiety was exacerbated by the Great Migration, in which hundreds of thousands of blacks left the rural South for northern and Midwestern cities, where, together with new waves of immigrants, they changed the social makeup. So the practice of people crossing the colour line, attempting to claim recognition in another racial group than the one that they were believed to belong to, was known as passing. And many African Americans who had European ancestry in varying proportions, some appeared visibly European. And they had this thing called the one drop rule, by which someone with even one ancestor of sub-Saharan African origin was considered black. So there's all this huge racial tension and madness going on with the idea of passing in this book, Passing. But it's also very much about sexuality simmering beneath the surface. So that's a great book. As I mentioned, Chaucer is going to be slightly ignored because he was actually a little bit on the negative side about gay people. He was actually very censorious in various of his tales about the idea of being gay and homosexual. So we are not going to go into Chaucer because he doesn't celebrate being queer, which is what tonight is all about. So there are lots of other books which I'm going to be talking about, in which being gay is very much celebrated in different ways. And one of the things I love about the books I've been reading for tonight is finding new modern books which talk about being gay in previous times and shedding new light on them. So we'll be coming to that in a minute. But I just want to talk to you about another older text called The Squire of Low Degree, which is another medieval novel which has a strong gay theme. So The Squire of Low Degree, which was an anonymous tale in Middle English, we don't know the writer, is an early verse romance, and I'm going to give you a little section of it in a minute. It was clearly written to be enjoyed by the masses rather than the wealthy or aristocratic sections of society, because the way that it's written is very earthy, down to earth, chatty, quite lewd, quite bawdy. And there are various different versions of the text. It was printed 3 times in 1520, 1555 and 1560 by various different printers. So it was obviously a very popular poem. And the plot of The Squire of Low Degree can be summarised as follows. The squire of the title falls in love with the King of Hungary's daughter, whom he serves with silent devotion. Although the princess discovers his love at an early stage and reciprocates it, an unscrupulous steward who himself wishes to marry the princess reveals their love to the king. The squire seeks permission from the king for a period of exile to be proved adventurous knight. So he decides to go off into the world and prove himself as being worthy of the hand of the king's daughter. But what's interesting is that the king falls in love with the squire. Um, and I just want to read you that section about the king who suddenly and inexplicably falls in love with the squire. Though sadly, it doesn't actually come to anything, but it's just quite a fun passage. Just try and find it. So did the king full suddenly, and he wist not wherefore nor why. The king beheld the squire well, and all his raiment every dell. Him thought he was the seemliest man. But leave me of the steward here, and speak we more of that squire, how he to his chamber went, when he paced from that lady gent. There he arrailed him in scarlet reed, and set his chaplet on his head, a belite about his sides too, with broader barras to and fro, a home about his neck he hast, and forth he went at the last to do his office in the hall, among the lords both great and small. He take a white yard in his hand, before the king, then gone he stand, and son he sat him on his knee. He doesn't mean on the king's knee, he means going down on his knee. I was confused for a minute there. And served the king right royally, with dainty meats that were dear, with patrick, peacock, and plover, with birds in bread he bake, the teal, the duck, and the drake, the cock, the curlew, and the crane, with visunets fair there were no wane, both storks and snights there were also, and venison fresh of buck and dew, and other dainties many one, and so on, for to set afore the king anon. And then the squire had done so, he served the three to and fro. And then, this is where the king, full suddenly, he did fall suddenly, and wist not wherefore nor why. The king beheld the squire well, and all his raiment every dell. He thought he was the seemliest man that ever in the world he knew or than. Then sat the king and ate right naught, but on his squire was all his thought. He couldn't even eat. He was so in love with this squire. But that is where that particular story ends, sadly, because we don't get any more of the king's love for the squire. And the squire does, of course, go off, have his adventures, and come back and marry the king's daughter. And we hear no more of the king's love. But these were medieval times, and that was just a lovely brief moment. And I just thought I'd bring that one in because The Squire of Low Degree was such a madly popular text, and it very much has this little moment of love between the king and the squire, which is rather touching. Moving on to more recent books, and I will be dotting back and forth very likely back into histories, and if people have any books that they know that I've missed, do tell me, because I'd love to know what I'm missing out. There's this fab book which was featured on Damien's Literary Salon podcast, Briefly A Delicious Life by Nell Stevens, which I don't have the physical book, sadly, but I'm just showing you this representation, which is a debut novel which focuses on George Sand's, who was a rather marvellous writer. In her time, she was hugely successful. She wrote over 70 novels. She was French. Her real name was something much more poetic than George Sand's, and I'm afraid it's actually escaping me what her real name was. Everyone called her George Sand. And she used to dress up as a man in order to get around Paris, get around the world, and even Mallorca, where she went with her lover, Chopin. So George Sand was probably bisexual. She did have her a long affair with Chopin, the composer, and she wrote about her life when she lived in Mallorca with Chopin in a book called Winter in Mallorca, which I have read, and it is a very beautiful book. And this book, Briefly A Delicious Life, focuses on that moment when George Sand was living in Mallorca with Chopin. And what makes it a fascinating and great gay novel is that the person who's narrating the story is a ghost who is in love with George Sands. So um, the book, oh, okay, I found George Sands' real name. She's called Amantine Lucille Aurore Dudevant. Amantine, which is a lovely name and far more elegant than George Sands, but much less easy to remember. So the book is written about George Sands's trip with Chopin to Mallorca when they went to escape the world, where they were both famous in their own way, Chopin as a composer, George Sands as a writer. And off they went in 1838 to take a house and live there for a few months with George Sands's children, Maurice and Solange, and also Amélie, a maid who dreams of home. And they stayed in Mallorca in the cold, damp cells of the Charter House, which is a monastery once inhabited by a Carthusian order. I've actually visited that monastery rather joyously when I went on a painting holiday, which I was leading as a painting teacher, which is something else I do, by the way, if anyone wants to come on a painting holiday. We're going to Lake Garda in September, just to put that out there. So I went to Mallorca and saw this monastery, which is where the book takes place. So I can really picture it, and it is an incredibly beautiful place, but also right on the top of the hill. And there's some amazing scenes in the book where George Sands and her son are climbing up the hill in a storm with the rain battering down, trying to get back to Chopin. And it takes them the whole night to get up the hill because it's such horrific weather. Anyway, the book is narrated by a ghost called Blanca, who died in 1473, aged 14. And she spent 3.5 centuries stuck on the island, and she's discovered this great diverting ability to get into people's heads, the heads of the living, and to see what they're thinking and to feel what they're feeling. So she gets into the head of George Sands and understands what she's feeling. She also gets into the head of Chopin and of the children. So she's able to be an omniscient narrator who can tell us what everyone's thinking. And she's a really fantastic character who has had a pretty awful life and death. So she died at 14. We realise, and I won't give away spoilers, but we realise that she had an affair with a young monk, and didn't realise that that could lead to her getting pregnant because nobody had told her that. And ultimately, that led to her death. But in this novel, she has really her first love affair when she falls in love with George Sands. And she writes absolutely beautifully, Nell Stevens, rather than the ghost, about the experience of falling in love. And it's very physical because she can still get into people's bodies. She is able to describe it very physically. And it's a very kind of evocative, beautiful, and poetic book, which I would very much recommend. And I found a review which was on Goodreads, which I'll just read you a little bit about because it shows you how this anonymous reader was deeply affected by it. They said, sometimes you pick up a book and it's so brilliant, so exquisite, so delicious that you wonder why you had to pick it up, why it was not thrust into your hands and told to just read it. You wonder why more people are not talking about it, why they're not shouting its author's name from the rooftops, why it's not in the hands of every reader you meet, on the bus, on the train, in the library. So that's about Briefly a Delicious Life. And I agree, it's a really fantastic read, which I'd hugely recommend. And it explores sexuality in all forms, But I think it's particularly interesting because it's talking about that period of George Sand's, and it very much brings George Sand's into vivid reality, and it made me love her all the more as a character because we completely inhabit her as she's cross-dressing, as she's smoking, as she's being very unlike most women of her time, and actually therefore she was rather hated when she was in Mallorca and had quite a difficult time. So read briefly A Delicious Life, and also read Winter in Mallorca by George Sand, which is another great one. Now, which one next? Too many great books to mention. I want to talk about the love letters between Virginia and Vita, but I just want to find those letters so that I can read you them, which I have found. So there's a really lovely collection of love letters between Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West, which has been bound into an edition which you can buy, and I would hugely recommend getting that book. And I'm just going to read you a couple of those letters to give you a taste of how great they are. So this one is from Sackville West to Woolf. And just to give you a little bit of context, Vita Sackville West was born in 1892, and she and Virginia Woolf exchanged the letters below that we're just about to read in January 1926. The two began an affair in the mid-20s that inspired Woolf's novel Orlando, which is another book that you absolutely must read. These letters came after their first separation. Their affair ended in 1929, so it was only 3 years long. So here we go. This is from Vita Sackville West, who was in Milan on Thursday, January the 21st, 1926. I do love a letter. Doesn't it make you feel as if you're literally there? I'm reduced to a thing that wants Virginia. I composed a beautiful letter to you in the sleepless nightmare hours of the night, and it has all gone. I just miss you in a quite simple, desperate human way. You, with all your undone letters, would never write so elementary phrase as that. Perhaps you wouldn't even feel it, and yet I believe you'll be sensible of a little gap. But you'd clothe it in so exquisite a phrase that it would lose a little of its reality, whereas with me it is quite stark. I miss you even more than I could have believed, and I was prepared to miss you a good deal. So this letter is just really a squeal of pain. It's incredible how essential to me you have become. I suppose you are accustomed to people saying these things. Damn you, spoilt creature. I shan't make you love me any the more by giving myself away like this. But oh, my dear, I can't be clever and standoffish with you. I love you too much for that. Too truly. You have no idea how standoffish I can be with people I don't love. I brought it to a fine art, but you have broken down my defences, and I don't really resent it. Please forgive me for writing such a miserable letter. V. So that was from Vita Sackville West to Woolf, written on January the 21st, 1926. And I'm going to read you Woolf's reply. So this is Virginia Woolf's reply, um, which is also in January 1926, obviously. She wrote it on the same day. Isn't it great how letters were so immediate in those days? I know we have emails and they're just as immediate, even more so. But I do love the way letters in the old days went back and forth almost as fast as emails do nowadays. If you don't write letters, maybe try it again. Write someone a letter tomorrow or tonight. So this is from Wolf to Sackville West. Your letter came from Trieste this morning. But why do you think I don't feel, or that I make phrases, lovely phrases, you say, which rob things of reality? Just the opposite. Always, always, always. I try to say what I feel. Will you then believe that after you went last Tuesday, exactly a week ago, out I went into the slums of Bloomsbury to find a barrel organ? But it did not make me cheerful, and ever since, nothing important has happened. Somehow, it's dull and damp. I have been dull. I have missed you. I do miss you. I shall miss you. And if you don't believe it, you're a long-eared owl and ass. Lovely phrases. But of course, to return to your letter, I always knew about your standoffishness. Only I said to myself, I insist upon kindness. With this aim in view, I came to Long Barn. Open the top button of your jersey and you will see, nestling inside, a lively squirrel with the most inquisitive habits, but a dear creature all the same. So there you go. That is Virginia Woolf's reply to Vita Sackville West. And I must say, don't you just feel as if you were literally there with them while they wrote those letters? It's amazing to read people's letters from 100 years ago. So I would definitely say, if you can get hold of that volume of letters, get it from your library between Vita and Virginia Woolf. That would be a great thing to do. Then, of course, there's the book Orlando by Virginia Woolf, which was inspired by that love affair. And in that book, it spans 400 years and it describes how a man becomes a woman. And it very much takes the norms of the day and turns them on their head. And it's an absolutely brilliant read as well. It's Virginia Woolf's most accessible novel and an absolutely great, intriguing, fluid, cross-dressing, cross-sexuality book, which I would say is an essential read to anyone interested in the way that queer life has been portrayed over the years. And it's also really fun. So, leaping from Virginia Woolf to another great modern novel, How Much of These Hills is Gold by C. Pam Zhang is a really electric debut novel set against the twilight of the American gold rush, in which two siblings are on the run in an unforgiving landscape. They're trying not just to survive, but to find a home. Their mother has already died, and at the very beginning of the book, their father, Bar, dies in the night. So they're newly orphaned children having to survive in this harsh landscape of the gold rush back in the day when they see tigers' paw prints on the ground, which is possibly not that likely that there would have actually been tigers in that landscape at that time. But they are Chinese immigrants who actually came over from China with their father and mother, controversially, because their mother was not that keen. And it's a really fascinating story, historically portraying what it was like to live at that time. But one of the great things that I love about it is that the siblings, they are Lucy and Sam, and Sam is born physically a girl, but is very much totally knows that they're a boy. And that is expressed really beautifully in the book. It's very much part of the narrative, and you're completely inside their heads. And it's quite a kind of magically suggested novel, but it's one that you are completely entranced by. And it's both epic and intimate, blending Chinese symbolism and reimagined history with fiercely original language and storytelling. It's kind of an adventure story in a way. It's haunting, original, and bizarre, and also a really great story of siblings being together and how they cope with being Chinese immigrants in an expanding country and them finding a place to belong. But it's also about Sam's sexuality, but in a very understated way. And it's the way that that is understated, which is so delicately, brilliantly done. So Pam Zhang, that's How Much of These Hills is Gold. And it's got a really lovely cover with a tiger on it. Moving on too many exciting books to talk about, and I hope I'm going to get through them all. I want to talk now about The New Life by Tom Crew, which is another book that was there we go, that was mentioned and highlighted on this Damien Barr's Literary Salon podcast. And there's a really lovely snippet of the book on that podcast. So do find that for more information and for uh, you can listen to the author reading out a section of their book. So look for that snippet on the Literary Salon podcast. So The New Life by Tom Crew is a tender and powerful tale of passion. By the way, if you listen to the audiobook, which I did, it starts off with an incredibly intense sex scene where there's a man who is in a train carriage, getting completely turned on by the man that he's pressed up against, and they are basically having full on sex in a train carriage in public. And it's very exciting and quite shocking. And if you're listening to it on audio, you don't want anyone else around, put it that way. So The New Life by Tom Crew is a erotic, interesting, shocking, progressive novel about gay men and women at the time of Oscar Wilde. And there's so much going on. It's a really interesting historical novel which makes you look at queer people of that time in a whole new light. I think that the author Tom Crew brilliantly gets into people's heads and portrays what it might have been like to be gay at that time, both for men and women. So it reimagines the lives of the two men who published the first medical textbook on homosexuality. Um, they were John Addington, who's married to Catherine, and Henry Ellis, who is married to Edith. And Edith is in love with Angelica. Angelica wants Edith to herself. So there's a bit of a love triangle going on there. And there's some very progressive thinking going on because Angelica's husband, Henry, sorry, no, Edith's husband, Henry, is happy to not live with his wife and to let his wife go off with Angelica. He's not gay himself, but he does have an interesting sexual quirk, which is an unusual one, which I won't reveal, so I'll let you discover when you read the book. But that is partly why he's more open to other people's sexual differences. So John Addington, who's married to Catherine, has met Frank, a working class printer who he is in love with, and they end up living together in in a sort of fairly open way, but not completely open. Sorry, it's adding a bit of a scratchy throat. So there's all these very unconventional lifestyles going on with two men living together, two women living together, a man married to a woman who doesn't mind living apart from her and allowing his wife to be with a woman. And the two men are writing a book about what they call inversion, and homosexual men who are inverts, as they describe it, in a very positive light. And they published the book in the hope that it's going to change the world. But just as they published the book, that's the moment when Oscar Wilde is put into prison. So it is very much the same. It's very much talking about real events in a way that brings it all home and makes you feel like how awful it was. And because the two men, when they write this book about inversion, are incredibly excited that they're going to bring a whole new way of looking at homosexuality to the world. But then Oscar Wilde is put on trial in the background of the book. We don't actually see him directly. And then he's ultimately put into prison, and they feel like their life and their hopes for bringing homosexuality out into the open and into public acceptance, um, all those hopes are dashed. Uh, and I won't give you away what happens, but it's a really excellent read. So this takes place in 1894. John and Henry write their revolutionary book together, which was intended to challenge convention and the law. But they're both caught in relationships, stalked by guilt and shame, because one of them, John Addington, who's married to Catherine, his wife is not remotely accepting of his homosexuality. She wanted a conventional marriage. She wanted kids. She wanted to live as man and wife. And he, on the other hand, wants to live with Frank, his the love of his life. And you'll have to read it to see what happens. But the title, The New Life, is the concept of a progressive society in which people can live freely without repression, a concept which many characters in the novel dream of or actively strive for, which queer people are still striving for now. Crewe does a great job illuminating the historic times and also the threats, fear, and moral dilemmas that gay activists and their sympathisers were facing. Not only does he incorporate the real trial of Oscar Wilde and his sentencing for gross indecency, but Addington's character is based on the real John Addington Symonds, and Ellis's character is based on Henry Havelock Ellis. And they both did write the first medical textbook on homosexuality in English. And indeed, Ellis was married to a progressive queer woman named Edith, and she did go forth and give speeches to the world. And she was incredibly brave and pretty amazing. But so all those things are true, but the timeline's a little bit different. And Crewe, the author, has not put in all of the real aspects of what really happened in history. He's fictionalized it and made it his own story. So read the book and I think you will love it. I would now just like to mention Oscar Wilde, because he is clearly incredibly important and relevant to this book too, because he stars in it in the background, not actually as a character that we meet, sadly. But Oscar Wilde, as we know, was sentenced to go to prison for 2 years, and he was sentenced to hard labour. And this was what sadly ultimately robbed him of his um, hope and health. And he shortly after that went and lived in Paris and died very young. But while Oscar Wilde was in Reading jail, he wrote his amazing poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. And I'd just like to read you a little section of it, which is the most famous section of it. You'll all know it, but let's read it anyway, because it's such a great excerpt. Yet each man kills the thing he loves. By each let this be heard. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword. Some kill their love when they are young, and some when they are old. Some strangle with the hands of gold. The kindest use a knife, because the dead so soon grow cold. Some love too little, some too long. Some sell and others buy. Some do the deed with many tears, and some without a sigh. For each man kills the thing he loves, yet each man does not die. So that's a poem which has many interpretations. I would love to know yours. They are many multifarious possibilities. Some say that it's Judas's kiss that he's referring to, each man killing the things he loved, the kiss of betrayal from Judas to Jesus. Some say that he's obviously talking about his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, who kills the thing that he loves because he put Oscar into jail. many people think that it's about their own lovers. I'd love to know your thoughts. Do tell me if you have an interpretation. So that's Oscar Wilde, um, one of the great gay icons, and also a background hero of this book, The New Life, which is a really interesting and great novel, which you must definitely read. So I'd also just like to mention The Heart in Exile by Rodney Garland, which was written in 1953. And thanks to Matt from the salon for bringing this to my attention. This is a book which is a landmark book in the history of gay literature, hailed at the time as the frankest and most powerful novel ever to appear on the hush hush subject of homosexuality. That was back in the 50s. It still comes over as an open and insightful treatment of the subject. So the word gay in the 1950s would not have been used in the context that we understand today. They might have probably used the word homosexuality or maybe even invert, like they were using at the time of Oscar Wilde. So the word gay doesn't appear in that book. So there are many gay characters in the book, including a psychiatrist, Dr. Page, the narrator, who describes himself as homosexual, queer, and even invert, as mentioned. So the novel is a kind of thriller, and it a kind of detective story, which is still a great read. And it's actually particularly a great read just in terms of thinking what it was like to be gay in the 1950s, because it really brings it home. So it's a well-written and engaging tale, and one of the first of its time in that era. So that's The Heart in Exile by Rodney Garland. Look at that cover. Isn't that so 1950s as well? So, more books that I must talk about before our time is done. This one, The Crime Writer by Jill Dawson. This is all about Patricia Highsmith. It's a reimagined uh, description of her life when she lived in Suffolk for a period, which did really happen in the 1960s. She lived in a little village in Suffolk, um, very much in rural middle of nowhere, about half an hour from Aldeburgh, so she could get to the sea. And she chose that place because she was 2 hours from London so that she could go and visit her female lover. So Patricia Highsmith was gay, and she had mostly female lovers throughout her life. She wrote a book, which I'm sure many of you have read, called The Price of Salt, which is another one that I should have mentioned, which is an absolutely brilliant novel and one of the first lesbian novels that has a happy ending. So very important for that reason. And that book is mentioned in this novel as partly as a great beacon of hope to lesbian women of the time, because even at that time, 1 million copies were sold. And one of the heroines in this novel says one of the things that made me most happy about that book was seeing 1 million copies sold, because it made her feel like she wasn't the only gay woman of the time. So Patricia Highsmith did a lot for gay women. She was quite an unusual and peculiar character herself. She was known for loving snails and for loving to watch snails having sex with each other. She used to put snails in a handbag and take them to parties with a bunch of lettuce. And she also apparently smuggled snails from France into England in her brassiere against her skin. Quite a bizarre thought. She also wasn't particularly nice to anyone, her lovers included. She was quite a difficult woman, but an amazing writer. So in this book, Jill Dawson brings that period of Patricia Highsmith's life to light, and she makes her an incredibly vivid character. She uses very slippery narrative, going from first person narrative as Patricia Highsmith to third person narrative. Patricia Highsmith is writing a novel, and that novel is also in this book to some degree. And there's quite a lot of questions as to whether the events described in the book are Patricia Highsmith's fiction. So, is it the book that Patricia Highsmith is writing, or is it really happening? There are murders in the book, and I don't want to give it away, but they're pretty shocking and brutal. And we don't really know whether they actually happen or not. It's a great read. It's very illuminating about what it might have been like to be gay in the 1960s as a woman. And she describes Patricia Highsmith and her lover brilliantly and brings all the characters very much to life. And I thoroughly recommend it. It's a great, weird, sexy, interesting, bizarre read. And I'm just going to read you a little bit of it to give you a little flavour of the writing. The room swims a little, and I wish I'd brought the sherry in here with me for a top up. By the way, Patricia Highsmith was also an alcoholic. It's all black and white hexagonal floor tiles, oversized white bathtub with feet, and blue glass bottles, high windows pouring in light. The contrivance of it, the schematic colours in here surprise me. Blue towels, blue china soap dish. I'm strung suddenly. What must Sam think when she comes to mine? Where she's lucky if there's a clean towel and a new bar of Wright's coal tar soap. Oh Sam, oh Sam. Sam is her lover. How will she cope? Sure, she's cool. She's a holder of secrets ordinarily, but is she up to the task? My heart beats wildly. I find I'm staring at the bottles in Sam's cabinet. I don't know if I'm thinking of anything at all, except that. A bottle of Fengel cream bath. My heart is going like 60 Plicks by L'Oreal for a double life set. The phrase from the ad comes back to me, and the stiffness of Sam's hair today. A tin of Cuticura. I really must catch a breath, drink some water. A box of Lillettes. A wrapped bar of Imperial leather soap. A jar of Endosil beauty treatment cream. I open this and sniff it, and yes, this smells like Sam, like her cheek when I kiss it. Senecal sleeping pills. Her doctor's name, written on the side, is Dr. Death, I think at first, incredulously, then squint again and see that the writing says Dr. Deacon. Morny lily of the valley, talcum powder and the packaging for some bath tablets, empty Elizabeth Arden lipstick, colour chic, a sort of tasteful pink that Sam leaves in mouth-shaped blots everywhere on wine glasses or white china cups. Something makes me gasp, blurs my eyes with tears. In a box, some contraceptive jelly in a plastic scallop-shaped container with her diaphragm in it. I closed the cabinet, put my hands over my eyes. Of course, of course. She said they rarely made love, but, well, what married lover admits otherwise? A horrible flash here. Gerald's white ass, his pants puddling around his ankles. There are voices outside the bathroom door, perhaps raised voices. A tremor of alarm streaks through me. My hand is shaking as I go to flush the John, aware that I've been in here a while. Just outside the bathroom door is the woman who was hugging Sam earlier. She gives me a condescending smile. She's wearing a grisly shade of peach lipstick as I pass her on the landing. So that is The Crime Writer by Jill Dawson, which is all about Patricia Highsmith. Excellent read. It surprises you constantly, and it's actually very funny, but also quite grim, and makes you want to read more of Patricia Highsmith and more of Jill Dawson. Great writer. So, one more book that I must clearly and surely mention is A Place Called Winter by Patrick Gale, which is another great historical novel about being gay back in the day. It's set in at the turn of the century. It's about a privileged elder British son, stammeringly shy Harry Kane, who has always behaved very conventionally and got married, had a baby, but he is in fact gay. So he starts an illicit, dangerous affair, which does shake the foundations of his muted existence until the shock of discovery and the threat of arrest cost him everything. So it's set at first in England, in the countryside, and then in London. And then when Harry Kane is discovered to be gay and to be having an affair, he's forced to abandon his wife and child, and he signs up for emigration to the newly colonized Canadian prairies, which are remote and unforgiving. And he ends up living in a place called Winter. But there's a lot that happens on the way to Canada, um, with a really fantastically sinister character, who I think is called Monk Truls, or Truls Monk. Um, he's really sinister and great. And the hero, Harry Kane, is looking partly just to start a new life and find redemption in a new place, start again, start afresh. But also maybe he's looking for love, and will he find it? It's a really great exploration of homosexuality at the time. There are many different gay characters in the novel, and there's also an American Indian character who is one of the two souls characters, who has both the masculine and feminine within them. And that poor, brilliant, beautiful character is put into an institution, and we go through agony as we watch what happens to him as Christian people try to convert him and turn him into either being a man or a woman. And that is one of the most intense and distressing aspects of the book. But it is a really excellent read, which I would thoroughly recommend. That's A Place Called Winter by Patrick Gale. And that gives a really great insight into what it would have been like to be gay at the turn of the century in both Britain and Canada. So we've had a bit of a romp through the ages, through from Petronius to the present day. There's authors that I haven't mentioned, I know, who I should have definitely talked about, such as Sappho, although there's so little actually of the fragments of Sappho's poetry that I do find her difficult to discuss. But she is the poet that gave us the phrase sapphic, which has become, even now, a word used to describe lesbians. And it's a word which people of my father's generation would have said, "Oh, that's all a bit sapphic," they would have said. So that goes back to the time of Sappho. But we've also romped through a bit of Chaucer, a bit of medieval times, the Squire of Low Degree, and on to the brilliant and excellent newer novels describing what it might have been like to be gay, looking back into history from now. So thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'd love to know your favourite novels, of different eras describing gay life from medieval times to the present. Do send in any comments and thoughts, and I will be back on my Instagram and Facebook Live next week doing another bibliotherapy live session. Do join me for that. If you have any particular topics or themes that you'd like me to cover, do let me know. And I will also be coming back to Damien Barr's Literary Salon next month to do women's literature, because it is Women's History Month. So I'm looking forward to that. Thanks so much for joining me this evening, and I will see you soon. Have a great night. Good night.